Thank you for being patient with me. Just been one of those days. So hopefully you've got in your book this right here. I'll give you this every week. This is our notes for this week's lesson, and then I'll have you next week's because I'm writing it week by week. I'm not using anybody's curriculum. This is all written by me. So I do ask, don't copyright it unless you have my permission. You say that, you'd be surprised how that kind of stuff happens. So we're going to have a few review questions to kick off today's class, and then we're going to start with our stuff for today. Hopefully you read your reading from last week. I've given you more homework. Don't read it now, but what was just passed to you, you can read that this week. It's pretty reliable information about Oliver Hart, and we'll get to him in a second. You've noticed that our class has dwindled a decent amount. So this happens a good bit in D groups, but specifically with history. I had a few people reach out to me and say it's just too much information, too hard to keep up with it. And I understand that. History is not for everybody because we do deal with some difficult subjects, and we had some people that felt like some of the subjects would be a little too difficult to get involved. And I don't know how the misconception came up, but some people thought this was a history class on Gaston First Baptist. And I tried to make it clear from the beginning it was history in the South. But anyway, so they went to some other groups, and that's fine. But thank you for coming back. Some of y'all are first-timers. Thank y'all for being here. Just to kind of open it up this evening, based on your reading that you had this week, is anybody, and really the reason I give you the reading is just to support what we talked about in class. That's all it is. It's not really any new information. It's just to support, jog your memory. So anybody want to share a little bit, anything you got from the reading this week? Mm-hmm. Yep. To get started. Yeah, very hard. Anybody else? Yeah. Yep. And we're going to see that today, big time today. Anybody else on the reading? I only gave you one sheet to read this week, so I got to give you a lot more next week. All right. Well, let's go over the review questions. If you guys would, if you don't mind raising your hand so we don't have everybody shouting at the same time. Just to jog your memory, who was the first Baptist in the colonies? I'm looking for a name. You can raise your hand. Yes. That's right, Roger Williams. Who was, number two, who was the first ex-evangelical in the colonies? Kevin? Same guy. So Roger Williams, first Baptist, first ex-evangelical. So we talked about that. Very interesting person. Number three, why did Anne Hutchinson get excommunicated? Not just from the church, but from the state of Massachusetts. Yes?
Maybe she was a little blunt.
A little blunt.
Pretty straightforward. Or...
Yeah, I'm looking for a little more than that, but you're on the right track, Richard. Anybody else? Tim? Yes, that's the exact answer. Spoke against the doctrines of the Puritan church. You get extra credit for this. What was the main doctrine that she had a problem with? Do you remember? Kevin?
It was sprinkling, wasn't it?
Nope, not her.
It was being saved by works rather than by grace.
That's right. So let's go another step. What verse of Scripture did she use to support that? Anybody remember?
I know she was using Paul.
Yeah. Which part of Paul? Ephesus, right? Church at Ephesus.
Yeah, Ephesians.
Ephesians chapter 2, 8 through 9. For it is by grace through faith that you have been saved, not by good works. So if you haven't memorized that one, that'd be a good one. So that is why she got excommunicated. So notice here on number 4, based on the historical record, not the conspiracy theory that we talked about, based on historical record, who killed Anne Hutchinson? Buddy? That's right. That's right. And I'll give you extra credit for this. What was the skirmish there in New York called? Starts with a K. Y'all remember that? Keith's War. Right? Keith's War with the Dutch. The Dutch settlers and the Native Americans, they didn't like each other. Okay, number 5. And we'll do this every week, so get ready. Did Baptists die out once Roger Williams recanted his Baptist faith? This is yes or no. You can raise your hand. No, right? They didn't. They didn't die out. So number 6, which church sent out William Screven? William.
First Baptist Church of Boston.
That's right. First Baptist Boston sent him out. We talked about this last week. First Baptist Boston is not a Southern Baptist church. They are in the America Baptist Convention, which is much more liberal than Southern Baptist. Number 7, where did the church at Kittery, Maine, this is softball, where did they relocate to? Kevin? Charleston, right? Is the church still open today? Yes. And so that's a little bit about last week. So we're going to pick up today. Last week we went from 1638 all the way to 1713. So my goal today is to get us all the way to 1795. And so we're going to take the same format we took last week. We're going to take the approach of questions. Now, towards the end of my lesson, I ran out of time to do slides. My office was a revolving door this afternoon, so I didn't get the time I thought I was going to have. Should have done it at home, but that's on me. First question I want to ask you this evening is what happened to First Baptist Church of Charlestown? Now, I want you to remember it was Charlestown at this time. It would later be named Charleston. But what happened to the First Baptist Church of Charlestown after William Screven's death? So William Screven passes away in 1713. And so what is very interesting, in a lot of these early churches, I mean, let's think about this for a second. These people followed him all the way from Maine. And now he dies. So would you not think that it could be very likely that the church would close down? At that time in Baptist history, a lot of churches were contingent on the personality of the pastor, not just personality, but the pastor in general. In other words, that's William Screven's church, or that's so-and-so's church. And so that's kind of how that was viewed. Now, I do want to clarify a mistake that I made last week. I told you it was 61 people that went with Screven to Maine. It was I was actually wrong in that. So it was 61 people at the church at Kittery, Maine. 28 relocated. So, yes, Charleston, First Baptist. So 28 charter members of First Baptist Charleston is how many he started out with. And it really dwindled down. So like most churches at the time, First Baptist Charleston went without a pastor. So that was normal. In the 1700s, like your other denominations, they had ministers because they were sent over from England and all that stuff. But with Baptists, if your pastor died, you're just out of luck. You just don't have a pastor. So that's very normal. And so in Baptist history, it's really not until the 1940s, after World War II, that we consistently have pastors in churches. So it's very normal to not have a pastor. And what I mean by that is circuit preachers start popping up in the 1800s, but there is a difference between a preacher and a pastor. And so we'll discuss that later on. We're not in the 1800s yet. And so I mentioned this last week. First Baptist Charleston went through some pretty big theological differences. We've talked about the general Baptist and the particular Baptist. Does anybody want to define what a particular Baptist is? It starts with a C. Calvinist, right? And so that's where they differentiated from each other. So if you and I were in the 1700s, we would be known as General Baptists. We believe in the general atonement, meaning that people have the ability to choose Jesus as their Lord and Savior. And so the particular differed in that. And so we talked about last week how the General Baptist would meet one Sunday and the particular Baptist would meet the other. That didn't happen while Screven was alive. He tried to keep it together. But after he passes away, this drift really starts. And as far as we know, we do not have good records from 1713 to the 1740s. Because there was no pastor. But we believe that those services at the time were conducted by lay people. And so the church did not have a designated pastor. That was very common in that time. So due to the lack of an ordained, and when I say pastor, I want to use the word ordained minister because the lay people were acting as a pastor. So they did have a pastor. It was just not an ordained pastor. And so anyway, so due to that, we don't have many documentation. And so, due to the theological difference, the First Baptist Charleston, they almost had to close their doors in the 1740s. We do know that. We do know the church dwindled to a point where they almost died out. Now, it's very interesting during this time that they are still planting churches. So they haven't stopped that, which is very interesting. They're about to die, but somehow they're still planting churches. So let's go to question number 2 that's going to answer kind of what I'm bringing up here. Why did First Baptist Charleston, it says, why did it close its doors? That's supposed to say, why did it not close its doors? Why did First Baptist Charleston not close its doors in the early 1740s? There are 2 people, and this is George Whitefield, by the way. We're going to talk about him. There are 2 people that are responsible for First Baptist Charleston not closing. One in a general sense, and one in a more concentrated sense. So Reverend George Whitefield, many of you have probably heard of him before. He is one of the most well-known preachers outside of Charles Spurgeon, I would say, to have ever lived. George Whitefield was a preacher in the colonies and during the First Great Awakening. Big difference between an awakening and a revival. Many people were getting saved. And so George Whitefield primarily preached these services in the northern part of the colonies that the First Great Awakening took off and made great impacts. But we do have record that George Whitefield regularly came to Charleston. So it was during a certain period of time while Charleston did not have a pastor. What would happen is all the area churches that First Baptist Charleston had planted, which at that time would have been around 4 or 5, would come up the river, come to Charleston, and hear George Whitefield. Now, what's very interesting about this is that George Whitefield is what we would call a flaming Calvinist, okay? I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I mean his Calvinist views come out in every sermon, is what I mean. And so that's very interesting because at Charleston you have 2 sets of Baptists. You've got general and you've got particular. But what's interesting is that George Whitefield is probably not what you and I would call a theologian in his preaching. We probably wouldn't call him that. If you read his manuscripts, we would probably call, I'm not saying he wasn't a good preacher. I'm not saying that. He was an extremely good orator. And most of his sermons were primarily topical, which at that time really spoke to people. And so, because you got to remember, they don't have people with theological educations. Their seminaries are not pretty much non-existent for Baptists at this time. And so George Whitefield comes, and we don't have a lot of documentation, but we do know that he came. We do know that there is a person in the congregation that he made a big impact on, and that is Reverend Isaac Chandler. Now, you have never heard of Isaac Chandler before, probably. Has anybody heard of Isaac Chandler? Okay. You have probably never heard of Isaac Chandler. You've probably heard of George Whitefield. But I think we would be doing the right thing in giving credit to Isaac Chandler for the fact that our church and other Baptist churches are still here. So Isaac Chandler was sent out from First Baptist Charleston to another church plant down the Ashley River. He gets word that the mother church is struggling and is possibly going to close their doors. So he is a lay person. He is not an ordained pastor. He is what you and I would call a backwoods preacher. And by the way, God can still use them too. And so Isaac Chandler comes back and starts pastoring the church. And so George Whitefield has revivals in Charleston. Isaac Chandler feels convicted. He comes down to First Baptist Charleston, the church that originally sent him out, and he agrees to preach every other week at the mother church. And then every other week, he's not at First Baptist Charleston, he'll go back to the church that he was part of planting. And so he starts this, and so during this time is when the General Baptist, and we do not know if Isaac Chandler was a General Baptist or a particular Baptist, we don't know. I would assume that if he was highly influenced by George Whitefield, which he says he was, that he was probably a particular Baptist. And so they start having these separate services in the 1740s, and so what's really bad is, as an older man in 1749, Reverend Isaac Chandler passes away. So he was ordained. He was ordained by First Baptist Charleston when he went to the first church plant. And so he passes away. But before he passes away, he does something really interesting. And I would venture to say he was quite the visionary. And so he realizes that he probably realizes he's about to die. We don't know why he died. I would assume he was sick. And so he probably realizes, okay, what's going to happen to the church? What's going to happen in the Baptist in South Carolina when I die? And so he's very smart, so he sends 2 letters. Notice he only sends two. Sends one letter to England and one to the Philadelphia Baptist Association. Now, we've already talked about the Baptist Association in Philadelphia a little bit last week. And so Isaac Chandler sends these two letters. At the time, the Philadelphia Baptist Association was the only association in the country. Charleston Baptist Association will become the second. And so he sends these two letters. He sent the one to England, which I guess that was just kind of a far-fetched hope that somebody from England would send them some kind of preacher. But anyway, the contents of the letter, we do know what it said. It literally said, we need a minister in Charleston, or the Baptists in the South will be no more. Point blank. We need somebody, or we're going to die out. So he knew that Charleston was struggling. He knew the area churches were struggling. And I believe that Isaac Chandler was 100% right. If a pastor had not come to First Baptist Charleston at that time, I think you could make a really big argument that First Baptist Charleston and the surrounding Baptist churches would not have made it. So we probably wouldn't be here today. So you and I both owe Isaac Chandler a lot of congratulations when we get to heaven. Thank you for sending that letter on your deathbed, right? Thank you for being willing to do that. So Isaac Chandler did pass away. Isaac Chandler never knew if anybody received the letter or even had acknowledged after receiving it, because right after he sent it, he did pass away. Here's what's really interesting about that. On the day that Isaac Chandler passed away, the exact day, exactly, is actually not the day he died. The day they had his funeral at the First Baptist Church of Charleston, a ship comes into the harbor with a young 26-year-old kid by the name of Oliver Hart. And Oliver Hart got that letter, and here comes our missionary, Oliver Hart. So Oliver Hart was sent from Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Baptist Association. Philadelphia did a really good job in training up young men. And so Oliver Hart, we're going to talk a lot about him today. And so he is known in history as the missionary to the Carolinas. That's what he's known as. And I want you to think about that for a second. Think about how, and it's really not the same anymore, but think about how you've heard through most of your life that we're in the Bible Belt. Okay? We've heard that, right? Well, there was a time where there were no churches in South Carolina, and we were viewed as a mission field by Philadelphia. And so Philadelphia gets this letter, and the association is like, man, we need to send somebody out there. And so the third question we need to ask this evening is, who is Oliver Hart, and what is his significance in Baptist life? Okay. There are three individuals, if we were to have a test, which we're not, if we were to have a test, there are three individuals that you need to remember their name when it comes to Baptist history. Number one, William Screven. Number two is Oliver Hart. And number three, who we're going to touch on today and focus on next week, is Richard Furman. Those are the three men that are the reason that Baptist churches are in South Carolina. But notice that it's all collectively together. It's not one of them individually. It's all three of them together. So we need to understand Oliver Hart, and because he's imperative in order for you and I to get a good grip on Baptist history in South Carolina as well as the country. I believe you can make a really strong argument that if it wasn't for Oliver Hart, there would be no such thing as the Southern Baptist Convention. Oliver Hart is the first Baptist in the South that brought the idea of cooperation. And so he brings that idea, and we're going to kind of touch on that here a little bit. So who was Oliver Hart? Oliver Hart was born in Pennsylvania on July the 5th of 1723. He is regarded by most historians, including secular historians, not just Baptist or Christian theologians or historians, but he is regarded as one of the most influential religious, social, and political leaders in the pre-Revolutionary War era. So he's kind of a big deal. Now, he didn't view himself as a big deal, but when the Revolutionary War comes around, there is a $30,000 bounty on his head. So that says a lot about who he was. And you say, who was after him? The English. The British did not like Oliver Hart, and we'll talk about that in a second. So, as a young man, he began his career as a carpenter. So at the age of 23 in 1746, we have record that he was licensed to preach by the Philadelphia, it says Baptist Associate, it's supposed to say association. He was licensed to preach by the Philadelphia Baptist Association. Now, let's stop right there. Obviously, that's the first Baptist Association in America. Does anybody find anything odd about that sentence? About him being licensed by an association?
Licensed and not ordained?
No? It's good guess. So before you're ordained as a preacher, you have to be licensed. But notice he's not licensed by a church. So that is different. The association is not a church. So at that time, the Philadelphia Baptist Association was kind of having to act as a church, even though they were not a church. The Lexington Baptist Association, or any association for that matter, does not have the power to ordain or license. That is the power of the local church. Now, we can allow the association to come in and help us, and you know, they can provide an ordination council and all that kind of stuff. They don't have to. Ordination and licensing is not in the hands of associations, but in the beginning it was. Why? Because they didn't have any pastors and churches that knew how to even do that. So that's why the association licensed him. In 1749, the Philadelphia Baptist Association received a request from Isaac Chandler, First Baptist Church, Charleston, asking if there was anybody who could come and be their pastor. So as far as we could tell, the Philadelphia Baptist Association financially supported and sent out Oliver Hart to pastor First Baptist Charleston. Now, I kind of want to think about this before, and before Hart left Philadelphia, here's the other thing. They don't even know if First Baptist Charleston is going to accept him. And the Philadelphia Baptist Association in 1746, the week before he is sent out on ship to Charleston, is ordained. So that's interesting. They have no idea if Charleston's going to accept him or not. Well, let's ordain this guy, so just in case he goes down there and they're okay with him. Really, they probably read between the lines in the letter and said they'll take whoever we give them. They're desperate. And so that's kind of what was going on. So before we get into a little bit more depth about Oliver Hart, one thing that I want to camp out on a second. So obviously we don't have 1700 glasses on. We have 2024 glasses on. If your church is in desperate need to have a pastor who can provide the spiritual leadership that is needed, would you accept a pastor completely blind? Now, for us, in our time today, some of you have served on search committees before. That's really hard for us to comprehend, right? We get resumes in. We live in the time of video. Before video, they had pulpit committees that would go to different churches and sit in different parts of the sanctuary so they don't get noticed, all that kind of stuff. So we have a hard time understanding what is happening here. But it was not until the early 1900s, I would argue 1940s, that you actually vote on a candidate after you've met him. Most of the time, early Baptist congregations voted on a candidate just with their name. One example of that is R.G. Lee. R.G. Lee pastored in the early 1900s, and this is so interesting, and I've got R.G. Lee's biography. If you read his biography, it's extremely biased, but it is a good biography. But the people that wrote it really loved him, and they let you know that. So they don't say the bad things. Anyway, he never pastored a church where he had to give a trial sermon. And that wasn't because people knew who he was. That was because the way it was done back then is you get a name of a pastor, and you vote on him, and he comes. And the reason that was done is because they voted every single year on whether or not to keep their pastor. So if they didn't like him, they keep him for a year and they get a new one. So trial sermons did not exist. That is a new thing, and you know, we can have another debate on whether that's biblical or not. We can have that another day. But they didn't do that then. They literally got a name and said, okay, well, that's our guy. They just wanted a pastor. Pastorless churches were common, and so if they got a name, hey, bring him on. So that's how that was done at the time.
Pastor, I have a question.
Yeah.
What kind of rule book did the Philadelphia Association have to follow about ordination and licensing? Where did they get there?
Yeah, that is a really good question. The only thing that I can think of is that they would have copied the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church was doing that at the time. That's the only thing I could think of. And obviously, they made up the rules as they went. I think they copied the general idea from the Catholics, but obviously, I don't know exactly where it came from other than, hey, that's a good idea. Let's do that. I don't think there was any that's a really good question. I don't think there was any kind of documentation that they followed. Other than the fact that they wanted to do whatever the Puritans did not do, because they didn't like them. So it had a lot to do with it too. That's great, Terry. Any other questions? Let me ask you for discussion. If you're, and obviously this, I'm really putting you at a disadvantage asking you this, but I mean, how would you feel in 1749? Your church is about to die. I mean, are you going to take a pastor blindly? If you're living in the 1700s, you would. But obviously, with how we operate today, that's kind of far-fetched. But you're going to see that God really used that. And I think one reason God really used that is they stepped out on faith. Now, I don't want you to leave out of here and say, well, Pastor Brady doesn't believe in trial sermons and search committees and all that. No, I'm not saying that. There's time and place for that. But I also think you need to understand that God does reward faith. And they have incredible faith here. How old is he? We don't care. Bring him on. We need somebody. Any comments on that?
Is it recorded if the First Baptist Church of Charleston knew that he sent those letters?
If the First Baptist Church of Charleston knew who sent those letters? Isaac Chandler?
Yes.
Yes, they did.
Okay. So it wasn't surprised when he got off the ship.
Well, they knew he was dying. Yeah, they knew he was dying, so they knew they were going to be pastorless. And the only way that they could get a pastor in those days is if they took somebody from a church plant that they had, or if somebody literally showed up. And which is really interesting. Let me say this thought. That's how Charles Spurgeon got saved. I don't know if y'all have ever heard that story, but in England, it was snowing that day, and he went into a Methodist church. He was 13, I believe, and he went into a Methodist church to stay warm, and there were 15 people in the Methodist church there in England, and the preacher didn't show up that day. That was very common in those times. The preachers just wouldn't show up for whatever reason. And so a lay person got up, and in the words of Charles Spurgeon, you can look all this up, he said, it was the worst sermon I ever heard. But he read the Scripture, and the truth of God saved me. Right? The Word doesn't turn back void. And so I think that's important. That was very common. Yes, Mike?
Having served on the pastor search committee, I would hate to say, looking back at all the resumes that we saw and reading some of these people, I don't think some people that submitted resumes were or had a calling, I should say. I don't think everybody had a calling to serve the Lord. So to accept somebody on a name, that would be scary.
Yep.
Knowing what I know today from that perspective.
Yeah.
We didn't know a whole lot about you either, but we were able to watch some videos and
Yeah.
interview you and those kind of things. So there was a process of leading to select you.
Yeah. Well, I think it's totally different, Mike. So what I mean by that is there's a bunch of pastors now. Obviously we're in a pastor shortage right now, but comparatively speaking in the 1700s, if somebody was called by God, that was viewed as a bad thing because you're going to be poor, you're going to be hated, and you weren't going to have anywhere to lay your head at that time. Parsonages didn't exist, all of that. So the fact that pastors were few and far between, I truly believe if you were doing it, you were definitely doing it for the right reason because there was no other reason to do it. Does that make sense? So it's a lot different. If you get a name, and even in the 1800s and early 1900s, they would rely on a name. It was totally different. And what would usually happen is that name would come with recommendation from another pastor. But that was all they had. Anything else? Good conversation. I love that. So, First Baptist Charleston, Hart arrives in 1749. They don't know him. He doesn't know them. And so God calls them. And I want you to see that God works in some really mysterious ways here. But you got to look at the fruit. Because if you look at it today, Southern Baptists are the largest Protestant denomination in North America. And imagine what would have happened if Hart rejected the call or the church said no. They would have died. Right? And so while it seems not logical to us, to them, bring him on. We want to continue the gospel. And so Hart goes. Now he is not installed as pastor until 1750. So he does have a proving ground time. I do want to tell you that. So they said that he could come once he literally showed up. They had no idea he was coming. And so he shows up and he's like, I'm here to be your pastor. They give him a few months, and so he comes and becomes the pastor. So question number 4, what was one of the foundational pillars? And by the way, this is a great thing to bring up from what Terry said. We don't really know what questions he was asked in ordination. So in our mind, he might have been fully qualified. He might not have been fully qualified, but you have to understand at that time, they would have guys that could barely read get up and preach. So totally different time. And so in 1751, I want to talk to you about what Hart brought to First Baptist Charleston. So after a year of being pastor, he brings the idea of cooperation to the Charleston area. Now, the Charleston Baptist churches had already started this idea of cooperation because they had already planted churches and they had already done all of that. So the idea of cooperation was still there, but you got to remember, he comes from the very first Baptist Association in Philadelphia. So he's bringing this idea of cooperation. And so as the people keep moving up the rivers, people start moving at a rapid rate in the 1750s in South Carolina. People really start moving, building families, building farms. Yes, this is where slavery comes into effect. And so we're going to talk about that more as we continue on in this. And so one of the first things that Oliver Hart does is he brings the churches in the Charleston area together for the sake of cooperation. And he's the founding person of the Charleston Baptist Association. And so the Charleston Baptist Association starts in 1751. Our church, I don't remember how many years, Terry and Sandra, but our church was a part of the Charleston Baptist Association for a period of time. And so that's interesting considering how far we are from there, but there weren't many associations. And so that's kind of how that goes. And so the Charleston Baptist Association is formed, Second Baptist Association in the South. And so the Charleston Baptist Association in the early years followed the plan that the Philadelphia Association had put up. And so if First Baptist Charleston had already begun to plant churches and work together, why do they need the idea of a quote-unquote association? So this is what makes Baptists so much different from every other denomination, is that cooperation, associations, and conventions are something we do that not many other Protestant denominations do. Here's what Hart decided to do. He wanted to bring the churches together, obviously to plant churches and for missions. Oliver Hart had a heart for education. And so this is where education comes into the Baptist life. Now, I want you to think about this for a second. He saw the need, Hart saw the need, and he saw the need because he got a random letter and God sent him to Charleston. So Hart obviously sees the need. Okay, what's going to happen when I'm not the pastor here anymore? They're going to be in the same problem they were when I got here. So we need to train up some people. And so Oliver Hart has the idea of education, and that does not mean that Oliver Hart went to Orangeburg or went to Sumter or went to any other small town in the Low Country and said, we're going to put a seminary right here. It's not what he did. What he did is the Charleston Baptist Association, the way they started, is it went church by church, which at that time was, I believe, 4 or 5 churches in the association. He would go to each church and ask them for funds. Now, what is he using those funds for? What he's using those for is he would find young men that had a call to preach, and he would use those funds to feed them and put a roof over their head, and he would train them every day. That is the first seminary that we ever had. Now, I want you to think about this for a second. This is training by a man that has 0 theological education. Oliver Hart has no theological education. But he sees the need to raise up and train these men. Oliver Hart began this work as the Charleston Association. He would travel around to different churches and ask money to train them. And he did this training on his own, and so that money would go to support their food, their room, their board. And so he would personally train these men one-on-one. Now this is really interesting. He has no education, but the identity of early Baptists in the 1750s became that of cooperation and education. So that separated us from everybody else. Because if the Anglican Church or the Episcopal Church or whatever denomination, they would have to send their pastors back across the ocean, get their education, and hope they would come back. So this has to do a little bit with Baptist always being viewed as the bottom of the rung, because he literally started training, just himself. No actual theological education. In other words, they couldn't read Greek and Hebrew, right? I mean, that's just, but it wasn't necessary. And so it's something that you still see a really strong resemblance of today. In the state of South Carolina, we have 3 Baptist universities that we as Southern Baptists fund by our cooperative program giving. Can anybody tell me the 3? Anderson? Nope, not Furman anymore. North Greenville, Charleston Southern. So Furman was a part, but we'll get to that later on. They left for different reasons. And so we have 3 Baptist universities in our state. We also have 6 seminaries that we fund as Southern Baptists. Does anybody want to take a crack at those? Southeastern, yes. Come on, y'all. Southwestern, that's where I go. Come on now, Southwestern. Okay. Southern, Louisville. Now, this is a kind of a tidbit. Did you know that Southern Seminary started in Greenville and then moved, Greenville, South Carolina, then moved to Louisville? New Orleans. So that's 4. Midwestern. And then Gateway. Gateway is in California. So we fund, when we give the cooperative program as Baptists, we're funding our state universities and also our seminaries. And so you can still see remnants of that today. So Oliver Hart is going to go on, and he is going to pastor. Let me see. Not ready for that. So he is going to pastor First Baptist Charleston for 30 years. Now, that is a really long time for Oliver Hart to do that. And so he pastors First Baptist Charleston until his death. So are you starting to see a common denominator here? Pastors did not leave until they died. Okay, that is just how it was done. And I'll be honest with you, that's not a bad model. And so they did that. If the people got upset with them, the people left, not the pastor. Very interesting concept. But we could learn a lot from it today. You might find it interesting, and they just released this year. The average pastor in the Southern Baptist Convention in America stays 2.5 years. These guys stayed till they died. So, very interesting. So, the guy that succeeds Oliver Hart was actually one of Oliver Hart's preacher boys, and we're going to talk about him a little bit today, and that is Richard Furman. And so, he would continue Hart's vision, his passion. And in 1821, which is what we'll talk about next week, Richard Furman is going to found the the South Carolina State Baptist Convention. And so it's interesting, his successor, Oliver Hart, started the Baptist Association, Charleston, and then Richard Furman's going to take that a step further. All right, question 5. This is an interesting one. So what's happening? Did it not work? There we go. What is happening in the rest of South Carolina in the 1740s and 50s in regard to the Baptist movement? So we talked about this last week, but below this line, and I'm being really generous with this line is probably closer to right here, but we've got Baptists over here, but they don't know that there's Baptists right here yet. Right? Because we're talking 1700s. And so let's talk a little bit about that, because what you're going to see is that because of Richard Furman, the Baptists from the upstate and North Carolina are going to combine with the Baptist in Charleston, and we're going to become one Baptist movement, which is really cool how God did that. Yes?
I did not know they were down there when Reverend brought his colony down here to Charleston and started that.
How did the people in the upstate not know that they existed? Because the people in the upstate probably came from Virginia and North Carolina. I mean, they had no way of knowing. I mean, it wasn't like it was on a billboard, hey, Screven's down there. Because you got to think, the Charleston people were originally from Maine. So there's hardly no connection with the people in Maine and Virginia. So literally, kind of how it would happen is word of mouth. And in this area, you didn't live here unless you were tough.
There were other people that broke off from Roger Williams and spread the Baptist.
I'm getting there. Wait on me. I'll tell you how they got there. They actually came from George Whitefield. So they didn't come, you could say they came from Roger Williams, but essentially what happened is when George Whitefield is preaching in the northeastern colonies, there are a lot of Puritans, Anglicans, other denominations that fall under conviction because he was a Baptist. And so they fall under conviction. He didn't know he's a Baptist, but his theology was very Baptist. And so they fall under conviction and they decide to become what would become Baptist. So they change their theological views. So they're actually called, and I'm getting ahead of myself here, but they're called New Lights. And so they call themselves Separate Baptists. So that is a third group. We've mentioned general, we've mentioned particular, but Separate Baptists were literally born of themselves from the preaching of George Whitefield. So that would be like all of us listening to George Whitefield preach, and you and I are Puritans, and we hear him preach, and we see him take apart the Scripture, and we go, oh no, I don't believe what the Puritans believe. I need to be a Baptist. But they didn't call it Baptist, okay? So they eventually morph into Separate Baptists, and I'm going to get to that, but history calls them New Lights. And so the New Lights coming to South Carolina, they obviously might have an idea by this time that there's some Baptists down here because George Whitefield went to Charleston. So if George Whitefield told them they were down here, then they would have known. Odds are they probably did not. It wasn't until they start morphing into the same communities and have separate churches, and they're like, wait, why do we have separate churches when we believe almost the same thing? Does that make sense? Because there's a lot more people living here than there is here. Anybody want to know why? Indians, right? And so if you're living here, what does that mean? That means you're in debt. Okay? And you're an indentured servant, and you're having to pay off your debt to England or to whoever, so they're sending you to the back country to be a buffer so that they can make all their money down here on the plantations. Does that make sense? They're sacrificial lambs. And so in my family specifically, that's how we got to South Carolina. Is that we'll give you 50 acres if you go to North Carolina, South Carolina, and we'll pay off your debt. You just got to fight the Indians. Most of them were killed. Great question. Any others? All right, so like I mentioned earlier, in the First Great Awakening with the preaching of George Whitefield in the North, many people accepted Christ, repented of their sin. A lot of the converts that come from George Whitefield's ministry are what we now call Separate Baptists. So at first they called themselves Separates, and then they end up calling themselves Separate Baptists because they realize that they are part of the Philadelphia Association. And yes, to answer your question, the Philadelphia Association, if they go back far enough, could find their roots of Roger Williams. That's kind of where that came from. Of course, if you take everybody everywhere, it all goes back to Roger Williams. But the people that didn't recant are the ones that became the ones who founded Philadelphia and all of that kind of stuff. So the reason they call themselves separatists were because of 2 Corinthians 6:17, which is the King James Version here. Wherefore come out from among them and be ye separate. So under the preaching of George Whitefield, they get upset with all the other denominations in America, so they become Separate Baptists. And so they were not called Separate Baptists because they disagreed with general or particular Baptists in the South. To be honest with you, they probably didn't know that there were general and particular Baptists. They probably just knew they were Baptists, okay? They probably didn't know the difference there. And so they were called separate because they wanted to separate from the religion that was in New England at the time. We talked about last week how people came for religious freedom, but they did not what? They did not get it in the North, which is why many of them migrated south. And so a lot of those Separate Baptists actually first settle in the inland of the Carolinas. And so they are referred to as New Lights. And so let's pretend North Carolina is right here. So there's a church right here in Wilmington that was called Sandy Creek. And it was a large church, 60 people. It was a large church at the time. And so they were Separate Baptists. They were New Lights. And so what's actually going to happen to them is they're actually going to migrate and plant churches in Sumter. So there is a strong separate movement in Sumter, and that's really the First Baptist Church in the Midlands. Now, there's also some separates over here in the mountains that bleed into the upstate. And so you're going to see Baptist churches start popping up in the upstate. The bad thing about the upstate is every time the Baptists plant a church, guess who comes and burns it? The Native Americans. The Native Americans absolutely hate the colonists. And so there are all kinds of stories that you can trace it. And you've heard, you hear people say, like I've said before, my great-great-grandmother was a Native American Cherokee Indian. And people, I've heard the phrase, well, everybody says that. Well, if you're from the upstate, it's probably true. Because It's really interesting. You look at the story of Pocahontas, well, there was a lot of those, especially in South Carolina. A lot of people tried to make peace with the Native Americans by marrying them. It didn't work, but they tried it. And so there's all kind of different things you could go into. I'm not going to get into that today. So they settle here, and in the Sandy Creek area of North Carolina, which is present-day Wilmington, they start coming down the low country. And so many historians look back on the separate Baptist movement and think that Baptists spread in the South to create two divisions of Baptists. So most of your historians are going to say you've got the Baptists from Sandy Creek, the separate Baptists, and then you've got the Baptists that were in Charleston that started moving along the river and spreading out. And you got to remember, the Baptist, yes, there were 4 or 5 churches that directly came from Charleston, but you got to remember, those churches went and planted 4 or 5 churches. Those churches went, so that's how Baptists really start spreading in the low country, and they spread across rivers. Now, does anybody know why the church in Wilmington was called Sandy Creek, and why many churches, a lot of churches that are older than us, have the name Creek in them? Does anybody want to take a jab at why? No.
That's the way to get around.
That's a good idea, but that's not why. They wouldn't plant the church like on the creek because of flooding, right? If it flooded when it rained. What they would do is they would have the church in the vicinity of the creek, maybe a mile away, half a mile away. They had to baptize somewhere. So most of your churches have the name creek or river or whatever so that they can baptize people. So that was a big thing. And so most of your Baptists in the 1700s would come in our church today and say, why on earth do you have a baptistry? They probably wouldn't be happy about that. Why? Because one reason they baptize in creeks and rivers is because Jesus was. And so if you read a lot of the early writings from these Baptists, because they did have inside baptistries at that time. The Methodists did. They had that sprinkling thing, that kind of stuff. So they knew those existed. But that's one reason Baptists split off to begin with, is they didn't believe baptism of any kind should be indoors.
Sandy Run is a good indication of that.
Mm-hmm.
Okie Spring
Yep.
is a good indication of that.
Yep.
Maybe water somewhere close by.
Absolutely. Right down there. Yep. And so many historians look back on that. And so the Baptists that came from Charleston and those that trickled down south after the First Great Awakening, I do not think personally that it was 2 separate movements. Did they come from 2 separate places? Yes, they did. But theologically, I think that they were aligned and that these movements became one, and we see Baptists explode before the Revolution. And so why did the New Lights see churches expand rapidly along the rivers in the Carolinas? We need to ask that question. So Alan, you're half right. They did pop up. That was their way of travel. But why are Baptist churches popping up faster than any other denomination at this time? The only ones that would compare to us are Methodist, and they were very similar to us in this way. But why were Baptist churches popping up quicker than any other denomination? Anybody want to take a jab at it? All right, they would put a Bible in anybody's hand that was a man and say, preach. That's what they did. Baptists were much different than any other denomination. They didn't have expectations, but they would license. Literally, and you can look at the record. If a young man could get up and speak from the Bible, they'd license him. And then before you know it, he would go and have his own church. Now, what I mean by all this is that they're not getting paid, and they're not full-time, so they're working with everybody else. But unlike other denominations at the time, the separate Baptists did not require their ministers to be educated, which is why Oliver Hart has the idea that he has with education. And so at this time in the colonies, every other denomination stated had documentation that said that their clergy had to have a certain level of theological education before they could be ordained and receive a documentation of ordination. Baptists were the only denomination at this time that did not do that. The only denomination that comes close to us were Methodists, because they put preachers on horses and sent them to every single little town, but they still had to be ordained and had to have education. John Wesley's a great example. But Baptists did not have to do that. So that's why these churches start popping up. Now, do all these churches survive? No, not all of them do. The Revolutionary War was really, really bad to South Carolina Baptists. We won't get into that too in depth. And, you know, there's all... I watched a British historian, a video. He stated that General Cornwallis and every British general that served in the South never burned down a church in the South. That is a lie. That is a blatant lie. Same thing with Sherman. Sherman said he never burned down a church. He did. So, you know, don't listen to that. That's not true. So a lot of churches that were in the Low Country were burned in the Revolutionary War. That's just a part of it. And so they were burned by the British, not by the Patriots. And so the separate Baptists, even Charleston Baptists, they did not educate their ministers. They just sent them off. If they could get a Bible in their hand and they were willing to go, they would go. And so that's how we were able to pop up so quickly. What really took off in the Sandy Creek area in Wilmington is once a man knew his Bible well enough, and they didn't call it Sunday school then, but if they could get him teaching a lesson, a Bible lesson, and by the way, when I say lesson or sermon, I'm talking like 5 minutes. They didn't have these long, great sermons that we might know today. They're very short. Now, some of them might be long, but most of them were short. And so they would get them preaching, send them off to a nearby community. So churches were popping up much quicker because of this model. The Separatist Baptists made it really famous. So I don't want you to view this as two different streams of Baptists coming into South Carolina. What I think you're going to find is that two different fountainheads of the same theological stream. Does that make sense? There's two different fountainheads, but theologically they're pretty close together. Specifically the separate Baptists. And so these fountainheads come together, meet together through one person, and that is the person of Richard Furman. So I'm going to give you an appetizer of Richard Furman if you'll give me 5 to 10 extra minutes. Does anybody have a child in child care? Are we good on that? Oh, Buddy does. If you need to go, Buddy, feel free to. I won't keep you too long. Any questions before we touch on Richard Furman?
And this is none of it. You said the sermon's long about 5 minutes. Have you got some proof or documentation?
The only proof I have is from the Sandy Creek minutes, but I'd have to re-find those. And when I say 5 minutes, I'm talking from the preacher boys that they literally said, here's a Bible, go. I'm not talking about the Oliver Harts or the Screvens or the Furmans. I'm talking about the preacher boys. Yeah, more general. What we would call front porch sermons. I mean, those small communities did know the difference. Yep. All right, question number 6. So who is Richard Furman and what was his significance on South Carolina Baptist? So Richard Furman was born in New York. Now, you've already noticed this, but most of the people that come down south were originally from the north. So they come down here, and so Richard Furman was born in New York in 1755, but his family brought him to Charleston. Now, Richard Furman is a really, really interesting case. So he moves to Charleston as a kid, and so Furman's father taught him Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, all before the age of 16. Yeah. So we do have documentation of that. Richard Furman did write down that his dad taught him that. And so that's a really big deal. Now, they didn't go to the Baptist church at first. Richard Furman is eventually going to do that. When he was 16, he heard a sermon from Oliver Hart. In 1771, he accepted Christ as his Lord and Savior, and shortly thereafter, he was called to preach. So he had a relationship with Oliver Hart. Oliver Hart was, you would call him his father in the ministry, so to speak. And so at the age of 18, so this is kind of what I'm getting at, Sandra. At the age of 18 in 1773, Richard Furman was ordained and became the pastor of the High Hill Baptist Church in Stateburg, which is now in Sumter County. And so that was a separate church. So he came from First Baptist Charleston, which was General and Particular Baptist, and he pastors at Separate Baptist, which kind of shows the unification there of the theological streams of the Baptist. And so this church had strong Separate Baptist affiliations and influences, which is why these two fountainheads came to be one. Through Richard Furman, he grew up as a Baptist. once he got saved, and then served in a separate influence church. So like I said, same stream, different fountains. So Oliver Hart, it says he hears about this young preacher. He knew who Richard Furman was. There are different beliefs on whether or not he actually knew Richard Furman. I believe he really did know him, but it depends on who you read. And so he decides to make a visit to reacquaint himself with the young preacher boy, Richard Furman. So he goes to Sumter County, and once Hart got involved, the separate Baptists started to accept the Charleston tradition. So the separate Baptists originally, once they came to South Carolina, knew the Baptists existed down in Charleston through word of mouth. They were known as the Charlestonian tradition. So it's kind of interesting there. And there still is today, there still is a divide between the upstate and Charleston. And the Midlands is kind of caught in the middle, in between. But some people in Charleston, no offense if anybody's from there, but if I were to go to Charleston, they would say, well, you're not from here. No, I'm from the upstate, right? So there's kind of that divide. You kind of see that very early on in South Carolina. And so what we need to realize in today's world is that we are much better Christians when we're together and not apart. And so Oliver Hart had a big part to do with uniting with the separate Baptists. And this happened before, during, and after the Revolutionary War. So now Baptists are starting to spread even quicker. And as an older man, Richard Furman decides to unite all three of these group of Baptists together, and he founds the South Carolina Baptist Convention. So they're still separate Baptists until 1821, but they're not hostile towards one another. So that's very important to remember. And so this is not the last time that we're going to talk about Richard Furman. We're going to talk about him a lot next week. One thing I do want to go ahead and let you know about Richard Furman, just to give you a heads up, is that Richard Furman was a slave owner. So just want to give you that heads up, like most of the people at the time. Now, what's really interesting about Richard Furman is that he preached sermons when he was young at the church in Sumter before the Revolutionary War, and he preached about how slavery was wrong. And then after the war, as he ages, he changes his mind and starts preaching sermons that slavery is okay. Very interesting thing with Richard Furman, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but it does divide Baptists a little bit when Richard Furman kind of recants what he originally thought. And in the First Baptist Convention, when Richard Furman addresses South Carolina Baptists, he actually advocates for slavery. Now, I want you to know that's not right, but it is a part of history. And so many of you have seen the movies, and where you see, I don't know if you've ever seen movies where in the middle of slaves working, plantation owners would actually hire circuit preachers to come and preach their slaves about loyalty and about slavery and how it was biblical in their minds. And so Richard Furman was an advocate for that. But he wasn't in the beginning. So I think that's really interesting how he changed. And we'll talk a little bit about next week why I think he changed. But anyway, we'll go from there. So question 7, let's talk a little bit about the Revolutionary War. Any questions on any of that? Richard Furman and how he gets to Sumter and all that? All right, question 7, what kind of persecution did Baptists in South Carolina face during the Revolutionary War? So we mentioned this last week. Baptists were viewed as the lowest of the low in religious society. Certainly those who were British in South Carolina, there you need to understand South Carolina, I think I'm right on this. I think we were the 9th state to pledge allegiance to the colonies. I think we were 9. You'd have to fact check me there. But I know we were on the back end. We were not one of the first ones that said, yeah, we want freedom. And that had a lot to do with the British ties in South Carolina. There were a lot of British hotbeds in South Carolina. One specifically that I always allude to is Clinton. That was a major loyalist hold there. And Charleston had a lot of affiliation as well. And so they were British in South Carolina specifically because Baptists in South Carolina focused on religious freedom. So most of the time your Baptists are going to become patriots because they actually believe in the idea of religious freedom. That's one reason they became Baptists and left the Puritan church. And so most of your Baptists are patriots. Many of the, just think about it. That's one reason why the separate Baptists even came down here, was because they were tired of the religious rules in New England that the English continue to try to push on them. So Baptists didn't conform to the expectation of other denominations that Baptists had to be educated. Baptists have always been a little stubborn to begin with, and the fact that Baptists encouraged men to pick up a Bible and begin preaching was astonishing and alarming to British people. So British people did not like the fact that we were literally handing young men a Bible and saying, go teach. So the British didn't like that. They thought everything had to be their way. And so we need to ask ourselves, what role did Richard Furman play in the War of Independence? So, and he's a young man, by the way, very young man at this time. He's in his 20s. He'd be my age. In 1776, Richard Furman volunteered to serve in the Continental Army, but he was told by the governor of South Carolina, who at the time was John Rutledge, that his talents could be used in western South Carolina, which is known as the Upstate, which was a Loyalist hotbed at the time. Now, let's ask ourselves this. Let's go back to the picture of South Carolina. Why do you think the Upstate was a Loyalist hotbed? Anybody got an idea? No? Way for them to work? Water? Okay. Not exactly. So, the good guess though. Sort of. Protection from the king. So, what happened is, as the tension rises here, the English say, look, if you pledge loyalty, we'll give you land and we'll put soldier outposts across the Upstate to keep you safe from the Native Americans. So the British had a lot better relationship with the Native Americans than a lot of the Patriots did. And I don't want to get into all that, but they did promise protection. So a lot of them remembered that, and they're like, okay, well, that makes sense. So we're going to pledge loyalty to you. That's one reason why Clinton was that way. And you know who Clinton's named after. There was a general on the British side by the name of Clinton. So anyway, so John Rutledge convinced Furman that his talents could be used in western South Carolina. It was a Loyalist hotbed at the time, specifically Clinton and Laurens. Both of those were big hotbeds. And so when I say upstate, at that time, Clinton and Laurens were upstate. Greenville wasn't really existing at the time. And so when the city of Charleston fell to the British in 1780, General Charles Cornwallis put a 1,000-pound bounty on Richard Furman. So I said earlier the bounty was on Oliver Hart. Excuse me. It was on Richard Furman. And so you say, how much money is 1,000 pounds back then? What would that be worth today? That is approximately $30,000. And so while Richard Furman is not fighting in the war, he is going into the communities of Clinton and Laurens and telling the people there, look, you need to have religious freedom. England doesn't want you to have that. And so he's an advocate for the Patriot side, not by shooting people, but by convincing people in their mind who they needed to actually go against. And so it's a very interesting tactic that John Rutledge comes up with. And so in 1778, Richard Furman led South Carolina as a state to disassemble the Church of England in South Carolina. So to England, that is a big deal. And so what does that mean? Not only did Richard Furman commit treason in the eyes of the British, he also decided to disassemble the Church of England. And it wasn't just him. John Rutledge had to play a part in that and the politics of the time. But South Carolina has not usually been a strong Catholic state. There's more Catholic churches now because people have moved here, but in the beginning we were getting away from all that. And so, in fact, Cornwallis was losing a lot of English supporters in South Carolina due to the work of Richard Furman drumming up support for the Patriot cause. Cornwallis is said to have said this to his English officers concerning Furman. We have a documentation of a letter that Cornwallis said about Furman, and I quote, "I fear the prayers of the godly youth more than the armies of Sumter and Marion." Isn't that interesting? So we've looked at what happened to Richard Furman during the war. Let's talk a little bit about Oliver Hart. So I've done so much study for this, I keep getting confused. I messed up earlier when I said Oliver Hart pastored until he died. He pastored until he was casted out of South Carolina because of the Revolutionary War. So he did not die as a pastor. Sorry, all these names run together in my head sometimes. So Oliver Hart was a well-known Baptist in Charleston. Most of the English knew who he was because he'd been pastor for 26 years at that time. And so he was revered for his remarkable pastorate. Many people revered him because he didn't leave the church when he could have, and all that kind of stuff. And so they didn't like him. One historian said in 1775, Hart's involvement in the revolutionary cause, especially in the recruitment of support for the Patriots, both in Charleston and in the back country, forced him to flee for a time with his family to the Ewa tribal lands. And so what that means is the British really don't like Oliver Hart, so he takes his family to go live with the Native Americans. So even from the beginning, there's a big contrast in the Low Country. The relationship with the Native Americans in the Low Country was a lot better. Oliver Hart is also the first Baptist that actually starts evangelizing the Native Americans in South Carolina. So that's another thing. And notice he didn't try to change them. He just tried to show Jesus to them. I think that's important. So you say, what were the Ewa tribal lands and where were they? They would have been in modern day Yemisi, South Carolina. I hope I'm saying that right. So that's where they would be. In 1777, Oliver Hart continued to advocate for religious freedom in South Carolina. And then in 1780, he was driven out of Charleston for fear of his life. That's when the British took control of it. I'm pretty sure, correct me if I'm wrong, Terry, I'm pretty sure the British burned Charleston, did they not? The burning of Charleston occurred, I know. I just can't remember what parts of it were burned and what parts weren't. So anyway, so he was driven out of Charleston for fear of his life. He went to Hopewell, New Jersey, and he pastored in New Jersey until he died in 1995. So even after the war, he chose not... 1795, sorry. He chose not to return to South Carolina. So Richard Furman would succeed him as pastor after the war, when the war settles down. I do want to let you know the 7 years after the war, really 8 or 9, were really hard times. A lot of people didn't know if we were actually going to make it. And so there were some difficult times there. So Richard Furman comes home, pastors the church, and that's kind of where we're going to pick up next week. So he would succeed him. Oliver Hart would not come back. And so the plan next Sunday, we're going to pick up. I don't know if we're going to get up to the Civil War next week. We're probably going to stop right before it. But one thing we really got to talk about next Sunday is 1821 to 1825, which is when Richard Furman served as the first president of the South Carolina Baptist Convention. And so we've got to talk a lot about Richard Furman next week. So we've made it to 1713 to 1795. All right, let's have some questions and discussions today. First, let's go with questions. Anybody have any questions?
I think the burning of Charleston was more significant than the Civil War.
Okay. Okay. I know it was burned twice. Okay. Well, I would probably go on a limb and say all the burnings of the Civil War were much worse for different reasons. Because you got to think, I mean, the English have the hope that they're going to keep Charleston. So why would they burn everything? Any other questions, comments, discussions? Anything you learned today?
The pastor, back in the early times you were talking about, how did they support themselves?
Yeah, so they worked like everybody else, most of them.
I mean, I don't see where they had time to work a job and pastor the church.
Yeah.
And I don't think the church is that financially.
No, they weren't. Most of them, I don't have record of what Screven did or of what Hart did or any of them did. But from that time period, most of them were farmers like everybody else. Most of them. I know specifically my family of pastors that served in the 1800s, all of them were farmers and they preached on Sundays.
And
Yes.
for serving, they may have gotten chicken.
Yeah,
Live chicken.
yeah. A pounding were popular. You know, whatever the people had, they would give them, that kind of thing.
They had pounds and stuff like that, but they had other means that had to be taken care of.
Yeah.
Money, financial wise, to take care of other things.
Yeah, no, they were completely bivocational.
Yeah.
I don't know what their jobs were, but I know for my descendants specifically, it was farmers. Yeah, they had to have another job. Didn't have a choice, really.
They just preached and never about all they did. They just come and preach on Sunday, work through the week.
Yep.
Like everybody else.
Yep, just like everybody else.
Well, it didn't take an awful lot of money back then. We got records that show our church would pay like $1.50 a month to the preacher, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And you think $1.50, well, that would probably buy an awful lot more than $1.50 go now.
Yep. And if you look at Robert Green Lee, R.G. Lee, one of his first churches was the church I came out of, Fairview and Greer, but he also pastored Lima Baptist Church, and on their website they have their history. And I think I'm correct in saying this, they paid him $12 a year. And that was, a year, $12 a year. And I think that was 1911, 1912. And so if you read their history, they had a business meeting and somebody made a motion that they raise R.G. Lee's salary by $1. And there was a man in the back, y'all might remember, they had a spittoon in the sanctuary, and this man was chewing his tobacco, and he spit in the spittoon, and they have his name, I can't remember it, but he's buried in that cemetery. And he said, we can't hardly afford to pay him $12 now. Why should we go to $13? And so the vote didn't pass. But the record literally says, and you can look it up, Lima Baptist Church, Travelers Rest. The record literally says before he spoke, he spit in the spittoon and then said it. Yes?
Did you say there was a divide between the Baptist and the upstate and low country?
Well, there wasn't an actual divide. It was an unwritten rule. And so I know from my experience, I had a friend that moved from Charleston to Greer, and he said, all I've heard about y'all is y'all are crazy. Y'all are rednecks, y'all are this, y'all are that. And so there was a divide, but there wasn't a divide, kind of an unwritten thing.
Do you think like in the early days some of that kind of stemmed from loyalists and patriots?
Maybe. I can't answer that for sure. What you got to understand about the Revolutionary War is not, a lot of them started out as loyalists, and as the taxes increased, they became patriots. Not everybody started out gung-ho as a patriot. Patriots were in the minority the entire war. Anybody else?
I got a question.
Yeah.
Do you know when R.G. Lee died?
I want to say, I know it was in the 1970s.
I heard him preach one time.
Yeah, it was in the 70s. Really?
He was a preacher.
Yeah, he was.
And his sermon, I'll never forget, the time of his sermon was Payday Sunday.
Oh, yeah. Yep. You know how many times he preached that one? They've got a number. I don't know if it's accurate, but they say he preached it 10,000 times.
1978. He died in 1978.
78. It was early 70s sometime.
Yeah, he was born, I think, in 84, right? 86 or 84? 86 in Fort Mill. And so the Payday Someday sermon came from, if you need to go, feel free to. The Payday sermon actually was written in the Edgefield First Baptist Church parsonage. So his biography that I've read tells the story, but he had, back then, Wednesday nights were more of a devotion. And so they had a Wednesday night devotional, and he wrote Payday Someday as a devotional, and one of his deacons came up to him after the service. This was in the 1920s. And came up to him after the service and said, I think you need to do some more work on that and preach it on Sunday. And so he did, and it became Payday Someday. There's videos on YouTube of him preaching it. Payday Someday. He pastored at Bellevue in Memphis for 30 years. Now, what's really interesting about R.G. Lee is, anybody know who came after R.G. Lee as the pastor there? Adrian Rogers. And so Adrian Rogers was after him. So what's interesting about R.G. Lee is the church grew a lot in his early years. But when you start looking at some of his later sermons in the 60s and 70s, the church actually started declining. Bellevue. And when I say declining, I mean like comparatively speaking. And so what actually happened, R.G. Lee is said to have said, I have a friend that knew R.G. Lee and verbally said this to him, a preacher friend of mine. He said, R.G. Lee told me that he got to the point in his ministry when he was in his 80s and 90s where his preaching was no longer relevant to the culture. Now, what I mean by that is R.G. Lee was a very staunch topical preacher. And he came from the time in the early 1900s where that was the thing. Well, in the 70s and 80s, a lot of churches in 60s start slowly conforming. The large megachurches start going to the idea of expository preaching. That's when that kind of starts to come along. Adrian Rogers was that way. He was an expository preacher. R.G. Lee was not. Now, I'm not saying topical's bad, but R.G. Lee was a topical preacher, and he got to the point in his ministry where that was no longer feeding the people. Does that make sense? And so he literally said that he became irrelevant. And I would agree, but R.G. Lee also didn't want to change. There's a lot of things that can be said about R.G. Lee. Very interesting person. Yeah, so good question. So expository preaching means that you literally take out of the text what you preach. So for example, if you're preaching in Mark, like we did this morning, whatever the text says is what you bring out. And so topical preaching is by definition, so I'm riding down the road and the idea of arrogance comes in my head. Okay, well I'm going to talk about arrogance this week. So let me find in the Bible a passage that speaks about arrogance. And so you pick a topic and then you find your text. Expository preaching is you find the text or the text finds you and you pull out what the text is saying. Big difference. Now everybody starts out as topical. I started out, everybody does. But as you continue preaching, the Lord might convict. And I'm not saying, topical preaching, I've done it before. It can be done tastefully. The problem with topical preaching, the temptation with it is it becomes a diving board. Of, okay, I'm going to start on this verse and I'm going to jump. And then if I want to smack somebody upside the head, I'm going to smack. I mean, it can turn into not biblical preaching. I'm not saying it's wrong, but you also kind of do a disservice to your people when you're in a different text every week. Okay, this week I'm going to be in Proverbs. Next week I'm going to be in Psalms. Next week I'm going to be in Genesis. How do they learn the continuity of the Bible if you're constantly pulling from a different text whatever you want to say? Or your opinion. Opinions, yeah. And if you listen to R.G. Lee's sermons, a lot of that comes out. Now, I'm not saying he wasn't a good preacher. He was a great preacher. But R.G. Lee also said some interesting things in his time as the pastor at Edgefield First Baptist. If you read this biography, and it's not in print anymore, but I can bring it to you. It's downstairs. In the 1920s, in Edgefield First Baptist, at the time he pastored there were 3 or 4 governors, former and current governors of South Carolina, in his congregation. And so he would speak to politics from the pulpit because it was topical preaching. And so expository preaching keeps you tied to the text. Great question. And like I said, I'm not saying topical's wrong. I'm just saying, but that's how guys were taught back then. That's what R.G. Lee was taught. It's really not his fault.
A lot of pastors, when they do revivals,
Yes.
don't do expository preaching.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
Pick one subject.
Yep.
Right.
Exactly. And so what I try to do when I preach revivals like this week in Samaria, all 3 messages are coming from Titus. It won't be the whole book, but it's the same theme coming from the text. That's a really good question, yeah. Any others? Any discussion? All right, I think we're done here. Thank you guys for coming again. Hope you come next week. Chuck, will you close us in prayer?
And Father God, what a privilege it is to come before you through. Father, we thank you so much for this lesson that Pastor Brady has put together. Inciting, Lord, for the faithfulness that those people showed all throughout history. Lord, I pray for our pastor as he teaches us here. And Lord, I pray that you would bring us back together Wednesday night worship. I thank you for all that you do. Thank you for your blessings. And I ask all this in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.